The bank's rate-setting Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, announces its latest decision at midday. It has cut base rate 5 times since last August, most recently last month when it trimmed rates by 0.25% to 4%. However, that was a cliff-edge call, with 4 of the 9 members voting to maintain bank rate at 4.25%. Today's decision won't be nearly so close. Economists expect the MPC to sit tight, not just today, but at its final 2 meetings this year on November 6th and December 18th. Markets now put the chances of another cut in 2025 at just 1 in 3. That's grim news for households, mortgage borrowers, and businesses struggling with the cost of debt. Instead of light at the end of the tunnel, the gloom will drag on. And we can thank Chancellor Rachel Reeves and Energy Secretary Ed Miliband for that. Their idiotic policies have kept inflation high and made further rate cuts impossible. It's a completely different story elsewhere. Yesterday, the U.S. Federal Reserve cut its benchmark rate to 4.25%. It can do that with U.S. inflation at 2.9% in August. More importantly, the Fed also signaled 2 further interest rate cuts this year, which could bring U.S. rates down to 3.75%. The European Central Bank trimmed its main refinancing rate to 2.15%, with Eurozone inflation steady at 2%. Other central bankers have room to act. The Bank of England does not. Thanks to Reeves and Miliband. We learned yesterday that UK inflation was stuck at 3.8% in August. The Bank of England actually expects it to rise in September to 4%. Worse, the prices of essentials are rising fastest. Food price inflation is now running hot at 5.1% year-on-year, while energy bills are set to climb by another £68 in April to an average of £1,823, according to Cornwall Insight. That follows a £35 jump in October, at a time when wholesale gas prices are falling. What on earth is going on? Tom Clougherty of the Institute of Economic Affairs is clear. Rising prices are in large part being driven by government policy in the form of higher taxes and regulatory costs. In short, we're paying the price for ministers' policy mistakes. Reeves is a one-woman inflation-generating machine. She handed public sector workers inflation-busting pay rises, hiked employers' national insurance to 15%, and cut the salary threshold at which they pay to just £5,000. At the same time, she drove up the minimum wage by 6.7%. Food, retail, hospitality, and other low-wage sectors have simply passed these costs on, leaving consumers facing higher prices in supermarkets, shops, pubs, and restaurants. Households are also picking up the tab for Miliband's net zero madness. By forcing fossil fuels out faster than the system can bear, Miliband is loading the costs of new grid infrastructure and renewable subsidies onto gas and electricity bills. There's a reason he's been labeled the most dangerous man in Britain. Cash-strapped pensioners are hit hardest since they spend a bigger slice of their income on food and heating. Instead of easing the pressure, Reeves and Miliband are piling more on, leaving Britain with inflation stuck far above the US and Europe. Reeves desperately needs lower interest rates to cut UK borrowing costs and create some fiscal headroom ahead of her nightmare budget. She won't get them. And as I've just shown, she doesn't deserve to either. Sadly, it's the rest of us who'll pay the price. Every time we buy food or turn on the lights, Britain's economic landscape has grown increasingly precarious, and the blame lies squarely at the feet of Chancellor Rachel Reeves and Energy Secretary Ed Miliband. Today, households, businesses, and mortgage borrowers will feel the tangible consequences of their policy failures as the Bank of England's rate-setting Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, delivers its latest decision. For all the promises of stability and prosperity, the reality is stark. There's no light at the end of the tunnel, only mounting pressure on an economy already stretched to its limits. Since last August, the MPC has cut the base rate 5 times, most recently trimming it by 0.25% to 4%. That move, however, was far from unanimous. 4 of the 9 committee members voted to hold rates at 4.25%, highlighting the deep divisions and uncertainty surrounding the bank's approach. This suggests that the bank is walking a fine line, balancing between the need to support growth and the imperative to contain inflation. Today, the decision is expected to be less contentious, but the implications are no less severe. Economists widely anticipate that the MPC will leave rates unchanged, not just today, but likely also at its final 2 meetings this year on November 6th and December 18th. Markets now place the probability of another rate cut in 2025 at just 1 in 3. For households grappling with mortgages, businesses burdened by debt, and savers hoping for some respite, that is grim news. The era of cheap money is over, and the cost of living pressures are set to intensify. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, central banks are moving in the opposite direction. Yesterday, the U.S. Federal Reserve cut its benchmark interest rate to 4.25%. Inflation in the United States is significantly lower, at 2.9% in August, giving the Fed room to maneuver. Crucially, the Fed also signaled 2 further cuts this year, which could bring rates down to 3.75%, a stark contrast to the Bank of England's rigid stance. In Europe, the situation is similarly more flexible. The European Central Bank recently trimmed its main refinancing rate to 2.15%, with Eurozone inflation steady at 2%. These central banks can act because inflation is under control, giving them the luxury of stimulating growth. The Bank of England, by contrast, is shackled by runaway domestic policy choices, leaving it unable to emulate these strategies.
The UK's inflationary pressures are not incidental. They are the direct consequence of Chancellor Rachel Reeves and Energy Secretary Ed Miliband's policy decisions. Latest figures revealed that inflation held firm at 3.8% in August and, alarmingly, the Bank of England expects it to rise to 4% in September. Essential goods are becoming increasingly unaffordable. Food price inflation is surging at 5.1% year-on-year, while energy bills are slated to rise again by £68 in April, reaching an average of £1,823, despite falling wholesale gas prices. Tom Clougherty of the Institute of Economic Affairs succinctly summed up the situation. Rising prices are in large part being driven by government policy in the form of higher taxes and regulatory costs. In plain terms, the policies of Reeves and Miliband are actively pushing inflation higher, leaving the public to foot the bill. Rachel Reeves' approach to public finances has been particularly damaging. By granting public sector workers pay rises that outpaced inflation, she added significant pressure to already strained budgets. Employers' national insurance contributions have been hiked to 15%, with a threshold lowered to just £5,000, affecting small and medium-sized businesses disproportionately. On top of that, the minimum wage was increased by 6.7%, further squeezing firms already struggling with thin margins. These policies, while politically popular in certain quarters, have a straightforward economic consequence. Businesses pass these increased costs on to consumers. Supermarkets, restaurants, and retail stores adjust prices to maintain profitability, meaning everyday households bear the brunt. Far from providing relief, Reeves' policies are exacerbating the very pressures they claim to mitigate. Energy Secretary Ed Miliband is equally culpable, driving a form of ideological economic policy that has real-world consequences for millions. His aggressive push toward net zero has forced the UK to phase out fossil fuels faster than infrastructure and technology can feasibly accommodate. The result is a surge in costs for renewable subsidies and grid upgrades, all of which are passed directly onto consumers via rising electricity and gas bills. This is not theoretical. For cash-strapped pensioners and low-income families, These costs are not a line item, they are a matter of survival. Food and heating consume a higher proportion of their income, meaning every policy misstep disproportionately impacts society's most vulnerable. When we look abroad, the contrast could not be starker. The US and Europe have successfully tamed inflation, allowing central banks to lower interest rates and support growth. The UK, by contrast, remains trapped in a policy-induced inflationary spiral. Households are forced to pay more for the same goods, and businesses are unable to borrow cheaply to invest or expand. The economic gap between Britain and its competitors is widening, with the blame squarely on Reeves and Miliband's mismanagement. While economists and market analysts debate percentages and policy tools, ordinary people feel the consequences in their daily lives. Families must make harder choices.